All right, well, this section is on phencyclidine, or otherwise known as PCP. It's a real quick section, I promise you that. It's the use of this drug is real limited, at least in my experience, at least in Phoenix, and looking across the country, it seems pretty consistent. But this drug is definitely the drug of choice for tranquilizers in the Black or African American community. So there's some slang terms for it: Sherms, Shermans, Sherman tanks, angel dust, ozone, and one of the most common terms lately, or at least when I was in drug enforcement, is embalming fluid. And we actually were getting flooded at drug enforcement with phone calls from parents saying, hey, what's like, I heard kids are taking embalming fluid. Hey, I heard my kids taking embalming fluid. What is it? And they were literally thinking that embalming fluid was coming from like mortuaries where kids were going in there and stealing embalming fluid, which is used to replace fluids in a human body when it's prepared for a funeral and burial. They thought that children were actually consuming embalming fluid, but no, it's slang term for phencyclidine, and that's otherwise known as PCP. So let's take a look. So these are like the Sherms, Sherman tanks. Shermans are actually a cigarette, Nate Sherman cigarettes. And you can see that the cigarettes are brown. So whether they use the Nate Sherman cigarettes or whether they use another form of cigarette that has a brown paper, the brown paper is pretty consistent with using this drug. One of the reasons is like on a white paper cigarette, it's like if it gets wet, you can see, if you've ever seen a cigarette that got wet, it's all wrinkled and translucent and you can tell it's wet. And PCP is actually a liquid, and it's contained in a bottle. It's a liquid that they actually dip these brown cigarettes in. And so the brown paper is thicker and it holds the liquid better. And then when it dries, you can't tell so much that it's been wet because the paper is thicker. And I'm going to show you an example. Oh, another one of the terms when I was in drug enforcement, it's wet daddies. And they were called wet daddies. So this is actually, see, here we got some brown paper cigarettes, but these are Moore brand. And so they're actually just like Moore cigarettes. And when you buy PCP, and PCP is really hard to buy undercover because it's in the African American Black community. And they're not just going to sell to anybody that knocks on their door or gives them a call. It's really, it's a tight circle, kind of like meth was in the late 90s, where meth users just kind of, and dealers were predominantly white and they were selling to each other. And it was like a tweaker circle. It was like this web of people that knew each other, and trust was a huge factor. Same thing with Sherman cigarettes or PCP. So what they'll do is they'll dip it, and then they won't smoke it with the filter off. They'll cut it off. But these sold for $10 a piece, and you can see they're still wet. So there's a woman in drug enforcement, and women have an advantage working undercover because guys, you know how guys can be, where they're more interested in other extracurricular activities with their clients. At least they're hoping for it, and so they're more apt to sell to a female undercover. And the female undercover that made these purchases, she was a young, well, she's not young, she was a Hispanic woman in really good shape, looked really good, and she could pretty much go anywhere and buy drugs anywhere because of the way she looked. And drug dealers were hoping to take this relationship past just being a drug customer, seller-buyer relationship. So she actually bought these in South Phoenix. Our office was located kind of in central Phoenix, and so she went and bought them. Came back, they were still wet. This is the only time I've ever seen PCP like freshly bought just like this. And so I'm like, hey, like, let me take a picture of those things. Like, that's not every day you see that. Now you notice there's aluminum foil. See how it's got aluminum foil on the ends, and that's just to help contain it. Like if you touch this liquid on your hand, it'll absorb into your hand, and the tranquilizer will actually affect you. It'll get into your body, and that's one thing law enforcement has to be really careful of. And I know a lot of the drug trainings I went to, they said if you ever deal with PCP liquid or you deal with the cigarettes, make sure you do not get that liquid on your hands because you will feel the effects. just like LSD. LSD can absorb through your pores and cause effects. So they're brown paper cigarettes. They're dipped in a PCP solution and smoked. PCP is normally contained in dark colored bottles, like, vanilla is like a brown bottle. They'll use those to contain it because they're UV sensitive and they try to keep the sunlight from affecting them. So some of the effects, loss of sensitivity to pain, like they literally, it's a tranquilizer, so it increases threshold for pain, like you don't feel pain. And they suspect that in the 90s, Rodney King and the whole LA fiasco where, the officers were, beating Rodney King, whatever. Anyways, they figured that he was on PCP and that's why he wasn't feeling anything. But it does cause no sensitivity to pain, where literally you can cut your hand off, your finger off, and you won't feel the pain. And so they're dangerous to deal with because the only way they'll stop if they're a threat is once their body just literally stops, because they won't feel the pain, and the pain won't be something that'll make them change what they're doing. So increased blood pressure, sweating, muscle rigidity, distorted mental images, and then stupor or coma state. So the sweating part, like you get really hot. And it might sound kind of funny, but it's true. But they get really hot and they'll actually take off all their clothes. They'll get naked, and because of the drug affecting them and their hallucinations and all that, they'll actually go streaking through the neighborhood. And I've been on calls, and when I've had African American or black students in my class, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I remember Uncle Johnny. When I was a kid, Johnny used to take off his clothes and go run down the street." So I mean, it's a real thing, and that's what happens. There was even an incident in North Scottsdale a couple years ago where guy, I believe, was on PCP, took off his clothes, and he was running through traffic naked. So it's kind of one of those things that go with the drug. So stupor, coma state, and then increased heart rate. So some of the signs and symptoms, this is a real easy drug to detect if somebody's on because of the way they act. They're almost like a robot. They have an inability to talk, or they have really slurred speech. And it's... And even when you ask them questions, they're delayed. They're like their mind is thinking. And so when you ask them a question, they'll delay answering. And they'll be in that stupor or coma state. They're just like, they just sit there. And you're wondering if you're getting through to them. And you ask them a question, and all of a sudden, you're asking them the next question, then they answer the first question. So they can become extremely agitated and combative. And again, they're not feeling any pain. So this is like the worst person you could ever deal with in a fight, where you can't talk to them. They're in a coma state or a stupor, more like a stupor. They're agitated, they're combative, they feel no pain. It's a recipe for disaster. They lack coordination because it has some of the same symptoms or effects of like alcohol would. It can cause hallucinations, which isn't a good thing when they're going through all those other feelings and all of a sudden they start hallucinating. And then pronounced nystagmus. Now, nystagmus is the involuntary twitching of the eyes. So their eyes are like, when they move their eyeballs up and down and around, or like sideways, it's very, I describe it as like a windshield wiper on a dry windshield, where it goes, kind of stutters. It's the same type of effect. So when to suspect chronic use? I don't know, when I move it, then I can't click it. Frequent reddish eyes, smoking of the Sherm cigarettes or the brown cigarettes. And that's pretty much it. Like I described the coma state, the stupor, the loss of sensitivity to pain, the reddish eyes, also the nystagmus. So that's really PCP in a nutshell. Again, it's an animal tranquilizer. It's made clandestinely. It's not made legally. It used to actually be, I believe, legal in our country many years ago, or it was used as a tranquilizer, but then the side effects were so bad they banned it from being made in the U.S. So I'm not sure if other countries use it, but it is made clandestinely. So that is PCP. I hope you enjoyed this section.